$104. That number right there is not just an oil price. That number is a timer, a countdown clock on your savings, your grocery bills, your mortgage rate, and possibly the biggest financial system the world has ever built. And the man who set that timer is sitting in the Oval Office right now, waiting to see who blinks first. Here is what happened. On the morning of March 16th, 2026, Brent Crude crossed $104 a barrel, and the financial world did not just notice it, it flinched. Hard. Stock markets from Frankfurt to Singapore went red within hours. Airline stocks dropped. Shipping stocks dropped. Consumer goods companies that depend on supply chains stretching across Asia and the Middle East dropped. And buried inside all that chaos was a story that most headlines are completely glossing over. A story about a 21-mile strip of water that controls the fate of 1/5 of the world's entire oil supply. A story about an ultimatum that President Trump delivered to America's own allies. And a story about what happens when those allies say no. That story is what we are breaking down today here on Crisis Capital. Not the surface version, the real version, the version that tells you exactly what is at stake, exactly who is winning and losing, and exactly why this moment could mark the beginning of one of the most significant economic shifts of the last 50 years. So if you have ever wondered what it actually looks like when the global financial order starts to crack, you are watching it right now. Stay with me. Let's start with the geography, because everything begins here. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway sitting between Iran on one side and the United Arab Emirates and Oman on the other side. At its tightest point, it is about 21 miles wide. That is roughly the distance you could drive in 20 minutes on a highway. Now think about this. Through that 20-minute stretch of water, roughly 17 to 18 million barrels of oil pass every single day. Saudi Arabia's exports go through there. Iraq's exports go through there. Qatar's massive liquefied natural gas shipments go through there. If that corridor closes, even partially, even for a few days, the global economy does not slow down. It seizes up. Energy analysts have a term for what happens when Hormuz gets disrupted. They call it a supply shock. But that word shock does not really capture what it feels like on the ground. A supply shock in the oil market is not an abstract financial event. It is the moment when the gas station near your house quietly puts up a higher price on the board. It is when your heating bill jumps by 40%. It is when the airline you booked your summer vacation on sends you an email saying your flight has been canceled or the price has doubled. It is when the trucking companies that move food from warehouses to grocery stores start adding fuel surcharges, and those surcharges end up in the price of your bread, your milk, and your vegetables. That is what a Hormuz disruption actually feels like for ordinary people. And right now, the world is standing right on the edge of one. So how did we get here? The honest answer is that tensions in this region have been building for months. Iranian-backed activity in and around the Persian Gulf has been creating serious security concerns for international shipping. The United States Navy, which has historically served as the guarantor of safe passage through the strait, has been stretched thin. And President Trump, who has never been shy about demanding that America's partners carry more of the load, decided this was the moment to draw a line. His administration reportedly assembled a list of 7 major American allies and delivered a clear message. You benefit from this oil corridor. Your economies depend on it, so you are going to help secure it. Send your ships or accept the consequences. Now, most people assumed this was standard diplomatic pressure, the kind of tough talk that eventually gets smoothed over in backroom negotiations. But then, something unexpected happened. Japan and Australia, 2 of the most dependable members of America's entire global alliance system, said no. Not quietly, not with a lot of diplomatic cushioning. They said no in a way that was unmistakably public and unmistakably firm. Japan's refusal comes wrapped in a very particular legal and historical reality. After the devastation of World War II, Japan's post-war constitution was written with explicit limits on how and where its military forces could be used. For decades, Japan has interpreted those limits as preventing it from deploying combat forces into what could be classified as an active conflict zone abroad. While Japanese governments have chipped away at some of those restrictions over the years, ordering the self-defense forces into a potential shooting war in the Persian Gulf is still politically explosive in Tokyo. Japan's leadership communicated through diplomatic channels that they support the principle of protecting global shipping lanes, but cannot commit naval forces under current constitutional constraints. Translated into plain language, that means we agree with your goals, but we cannot send our ships into a war zone. Australia's refusal hits differently because Australia does not have that constitutional excuse. Canberra has fought alongside Washington in virtually every major military engagement since World War II. It is part of the AUKUS Security Pact. It shares intelligence with the United States at the deepest levels. And yet Australia's Defence Minister Catherine King made clear that deploying Australian naval assets into what looks increasingly like a direct conflict environment requires a level of domestic political consensus and risk assessment that her government was not in a position to deliver on short notice. To put it simply, Australia looked at the situation in the Strait of Hormuz and decided the risk calculation did not add up. That is a significant statement from one of Washington's closest partners in the Indo-Pacific. Here is why these two refusals matter far beyond the immediate military question. The alliance system that the United States built after World War II was held together by a core assumption. That assumption was that when America calls, allies answer, not out of blind obedience, but because the entire security framework, the protection, the trade access, the intelligence sharing, all of it was built on the expectation of mutual support in moments of crisis. When Japan and Australia publicly decline a direct American request, they're not just saying no to one mission, they are signaling that the automatic reflex of deference to Washington is weakening. And that signal is being read very carefully in capitals all around the world, including Beijing. China is the central character in the next chapter of this story, and this is where it gets really strategic. Trump has been saying out loud what a lot of American policymakers have been thinking privately for years. China imports roughly 90% of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. China's entire economic model, its manufacturing, its military buildup, its global infrastructure projects, all of it runs on energy that flows through those 21 miles. So Trump's argument is blunt and pointed. Why should American taxpayers fund the security of a corridor that primarily serves China's economy and underwrites China's military expansion? It is a question that puts Beijing in an impossible position. China could theoretically deploy its own naval assets to help protect the strait. But doing so would be an enormous geopolitical statement, one that invites enormous scrutiny about China's global military ambitions. Beijing would rather keep enjoying the benefits of American-provided security while quietly building its own alternatives. Trump is trying to make that free ride impossible to ignore. This is also why the planned meeting between Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping is now under serious strain. That meeting was supposed to be a stabilizing moment, a chance to reset the trade relationship and ease some of the tension that has been building between the world's two largest economies. But Trump's team has now made clear that the Hormuz situation is part of the negotiating framework. In other words, the Strait of Hormuz has just become a chip in the most important bilateral negotiation on the planet. If you want smooth trade relations with the United States, you have to be part of the solution on energy security. That is Trump's play. And whether you think it is brilliant or reckless, it is absolutely changing the terms of the global conversation. Now, let's talk dollars and cents, because this is where it gets visceral. $104 oil is painful, but analysts are no longer treating that as the ceiling. If this standoff continues for 2 more weeks without a clear resolution, some of the more sober voices in the energy market are openly modeling a path to $120, even $150 a barrel. Let that sink in for a moment. The last time crude oil was at $150, central banks around the world were still fighting the inflation spike that came out of the post-COVID supply chain crisis. They managed to bring that inflation down, slowly and painfully, through years of aggressive interest rate hikes that crushed housing markets, squeezed small businesses, and hammered anyone carrying variable rate debt. If oil spikes to $150 now, just as central banks were finally preparing to cut rates and give the economy some breathing room, everything changes. The Fed would have to pause its rate cuts or even reverse course. Mortgages stay expensive. Business loans stay expensive. Consumer spending contracts. The recession risk that everyone spent the last 2 years worrying about comes back with a vengeance. The aviation industry is already bleeding. Dubai, Doha, and Abu Dhabi are 3 of the busiest air transit hubs in the world, and any disruption to the security environment in the Gulf ripples directly into flight operations. Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, and several other Southeast Asian economies that import the majority of their energy from Gulf producers are already seeing supply pressure. These are not rich countries with deep reserve buffers. They are emerging economies, where a sudden 40 or 50% jump in energy costs translates quickly into food inflation, currency pressure, and social instability. When the Gulf sneezes, Southeast Asia catches pneumonia. Meanwhile, gold is climbing and the dollar is strengthening, which sounds good if you are American, but is quietly catastrophic for dozens of emerging market nations that borrowed in dollars and now have to repay those loans with currencies that are losing value fast. This is the hidden damage that rarely makes the front page, but causes enormous human suffering when it compounds over months. And underneath all of this, there's a deeper current that very few mainstream commentators are talking about. This crisis is accelerating a conversation that has been happening in hushed tones inside finance ministries and central banks for years. The conversation about the petrodollar. Since the 1970s, the entire global oil trade has been priced in US dollars. That arrangement gave America extraordinary leverage over the global financial system. It created built-in demand for dollars everywhere on Earth. It allowed the United States to impose financial sanctions as a foreign policy weapon. But cracks have been forming. China and Russia have been settling energy trades in yuan. India has been experimenting with rupee-denominated oil purchases. The BRICS nations have been publicly discussing alternatives to the dollar settlement system. None of those alternatives is anywhere close to ready to replace the dollar. But every time a crisis like this one reveals uncertainty about American leadership and commitment, it gives more countries a little more urgency to keep building toward those alternatives. If you are thinking about the long-term future of the global financial order, you need to be paying attention to this. What happens in the Strait of Hormuz does not stay in the Strait of Hormuz. So where does this go from here? There are three realistic scenarios. The first is a negotiated de-escalation, where diplomatic back channels produce some kind of temporary arrangement, tensions cool, oil prices pull back, and markets breathe again. That is the hopeful scenario. The second is a prolonged standoff, where the situation stays tense and unresolved. Energy prices stay elevated, the global economy absorbs the hit but keeps moving, and all the big structural questions about alliances and energy security get pushed into a slower, longer renegotiation. That is probably the most likely scenario in the near term. The third scenario is escalation, a miscalculation, an incident involving a tanker, a direct military confrontation, something that turns this from a geopolitical standoff into an actual shooting conflict. That scenario is not the most probable one, but it is no longer as remote as it was 6 months ago. And if it happens, the economic consequences would be severe enough to affect every single person watching this, no matter where they live. At Crisis Capital, we are going to keep tracking every move in this story as it develops, because the details matter and the timing matters, and understanding the difference between noise and signal is the whole game right now. Before you go, I need you to do something. Think about one person in your life, a friend, a family member, a colleague, who's probably confused about why gas prices are moving, why their investment portfolio is doing weird things, why the news feels increasingly chaotic. Send them this video, right now, not later. Because the people who understand what is actually happening are the ones who will be able to make smarter decisions in the months ahead. Drop a comment below telling me what you think Trump's real endgame is here. Is this a masterstroke that forces the world to finally share the security burden? Or is it a gamble that could permanently fracture the alliance system that kept the peace for 80 years? I genuinely want to know what you think. Subscribe to Crisis Capital, hit the bell, and stay close, because the next update on this story could come at any time. In a world moving this fast, the most dangerous thing you can be is uninformed.